Verse 25, for David says of him. Now, interestingly, if you read the psalm that Peter's quoting here, the psalm actually is written as if David is speaking of himself. And yet we know that prophetically, many of the psalms have David as their initial, perhaps maybe even partial or prophetic antecedent, and yet in a messianic way, they look forward to the Messiah. They've been utilized and recognized by the New Testament writers authoritatively by the Holy Spirit, of course, that they are ultimately pointing to the greater king who is David's descendant, right? So I saw the Lord continually before me because he's at my right hand, so that I will not be shaken. Notice right away that whoever is writing in this psalm, which is David, he says, I saw the Lord continually before me because he is at my right hand so that I will not be shaken. Who is this person in the psalm writing about? Who is this Lord that's continually before him? And that is at his right hand, at the right hand of the writer. Is it David addressing God? Recognize that God is at David's right hand? That's a possibility. Or is it the words of the Messiah speaking about God as Father, who's at his right hand? That God as Father is at his right hand. Remember that position of power and protection and also authority, that God is at the right hand of a king. That's not to be confused with the Messiah sitting at the right hand of the Father. That's slightly different. They both use the phrase right hand, but there's a bit of different nuance between which context and imagery you should know that's taking place. But otherwise, we could have David speaking. We could have we could have Messiah speaking. But it's probably not God speaking, who says, I saw the Lord continually before me, right? God putting his son in front of him because my son is at my right hand so that I will not be shaken. Well, that certainly doesn't seem to fit the context. Yet we know that the Messiah is at the right hand of God. And so if God is speaking, saying that I, God, saw the Lord, my son, Messiah, Yeshua, continually before me because he, my son, is at my right hand, right? That's the imagery of Psalm 110:1. My Messiah, my son is at my right hand, God speaking, right? Yahweh says to Adonai, or Yahweh said to Adoni, sit at my right hand so that I will not be shaken. Okay, that doesn't work. God the Father is never shaken. Right? That's just established. So we can kind of just cross out the possibility that this is God speaking in first person. Instead, it's more likely that it's either David speaking about God's being positioned at his right hand in a place of authority and a place of protection and might, or it's the Messiah speaking about his own Father sitting at his right hand, or not sitting, but at his right hand, to protect him and to give him power. Notice the word sitting there is probably not in verse 5 of Psalm 110, nor is it in this particular psalm. So let's keep reading. Verse 26, the psalmist writes, therefore my heart was glad and my tongue was overjoyed. Remember, you have to picture when you're reading this as a Christian that this is either David writing about himself in his relationship with God and seeing his future descendant, as well as Messiah reading the words of David and applying them to himself. Messiah speaking in first person, therefore my heart, Jesus says, my heart was glad and my tongue was overjoyed. But David wrote it in his own first person account, but now Messiah can read these and realize that these messianic prophecies were speaking of him. So we have to allow for that kind of overlapping of David speaking of himself and yet Jesus applying the words to himself. And then the Christian authors such as Peter realizing that ultimately these words are applicable to Messiah. Moreover, this writer puts, my flesh will also live in hope. That could be David, could be Yeshua, could be both. For, verse 27, you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. Who said those words? Was it David who said those words? Or is it Messiah prophetically saying those words that when Jesus finally read the Psalms after he was brought in as a human into the world, he read those words and realized, these words are my words because David spoke of me. Now, here's your challenge. If it was David speaking those words, then watch what happens. Let's keep reading. Verse 28. You have made known to me the ways of life. Either David could have said that or Yeshua could have said that. Speaking of God the Father. They're both addressing God the Father, but who is the addressee? Who wrote the words? Is it David? Is it Yeshua? That's the question. They're both talking to God when they say you. You have known to made to me. You, O God. You, O Yahweh. Or in Yeshua's own words, you, O Father. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. End. So Peter stops his quotation from the psalm there. But notice what Peter does. If it was merely David who wrote those words and not the Master Yeshua who was acknowledging his identification with those words, watch what Peter says to these Jewish people that are gathered there listening to his drasha, his sermon. He says, brothers, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. So, verse 30, because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to do what? To seat one of his descendants on his throne, he, David, looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection, not of David himself, but of the Christ. So what is Peter doing? Peter is acknowledging that David wrote the psalm, but David, under the inspiration of the Spirit, like Yeshua said, David under the Spirit was speaking of the Messiah as the one who would not be abandoned to Hades, of the Christ, his descendant, who would not be left in the grave for his body to rot and decay, but would indeed be raised up by God, his father and David's descendant. So David was not saying that those words are mine. Now, David was writing under the power of the Spirit. How much he knew about his future descendant, we can't say for certain. How much of a picture God was revealing to him, we can't say with absolute certainty. But what we can say with certainty is that by the time of the New Testament era, Peter, under the power of the Spirit, which has been authorized now by God and canonized for us and authorized and made authoritative for us as New Testament writings, biblical writings. Peter was verifying for us now that when we read those words in that psalm, which is not Psalm 110, by the way, when we read those words, we can now know that David, even if he was in partial fulfillment or antecedent fulfillment or near far prophecy, whatever, if he was just hinting at his own life, ultimately this must refer to Jesus. Why? Because David died and was buried and did not resurrect yet. Now he will resurrect someday, according to Old Testament prophecies, according to resurrection. But notice as we keep reading in verse 31, David looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection, not of David, but of the Christ, and that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. Contrastingly, David's soul, or David's body, I should say, David's body, we don't want to say it was abandoned to Hades, but we can say it was resting in the grave. David's flesh definitely suffered decay. His body decayed. Why? Because his time of resurrection was not then. David died and his body rotted away. But by comparison, Jesus died, was buried, but he didn't stay in the ground. He was resurrected. So how does this play back into Psalm 110 and verse 1 and verse 5 and our discussion about is Messiah merely human or is he divine? Let's let Peter continue saying his words, because now he's going to bring in Psalm 110, but it's within the context of his earlier quote. So Peter continues in verse 32. It is this Jesus whom God raised up. He's contrasting with the idea that it's not David that got raised up per that psalm where his body didn't suffer decay. It's Yeshua, the Messiah, the one we call Lord. He's the one that God raised up. A fact, Peter says, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, verse 33, since he has been exalted. Now notice he's going to start transitioning. When he says exalted, he's going to pull in these themes that are already written in the Psalm 110 from our passage, right? Since he has been exalted at the right hand of God. Now stop. This idea of being exalted at God's right hand, even if it's a human Messiah only, who else has ever been exalted to the right hand of God? Do I have an answer? Anyone? Wow, the silence speaks volumes. Why? Because not even King David was exalted to the right hand of God in heaven. No human being has ever been exalted to the right hand of God in heaven. And yet Jesus was raised up by God, not David. Jesus was raised from the grave. His body did not see decay. And in verse 33, Peter explicitly says that he has been exalted at the right hand of God and has received the promise of the Holy Spirit from the Father. He has poured out this which you both see and hear. So he's speaking about Pentecost, right? This is Acts chapter 2. And the festival of Shavuot. But the point I'm trying to emphasize for a moment, for you to stop and wrestle with and to chew on, is as we're having this discussion with biblical Unitarians and those who are not Trinitarians, and this argument over, is the figure in Psalm 110:1, the one seated at God's right hand, is he merely human or is he divine? And who is the person in verse 5 sitting at the right hand of someone else? Is it Adonai? Is it Adonai? If, in the end, it's almost a moot point whether it's Adonai or Adonai. It doesn't matter. The point really is this. The person seated at the right hand of God is a very unique person and is a spot that no one else ever has occupied and never will occupy, ever. Jesus is the only one who is at that point. Now, I say it's a moot point in terms of Adonai versus Adonai, but it's not a moot point as to the meaning behind being exalted at the right hand. What we've lost in our 21st century is the idea that being seated at the right hand is a position of equality with God, as in co-ruling with God. God does not share his rulership with just anyone, human or otherwise. Understand what I'm saying here? God's authority is established as the highest authority there is. Therefore, if God seats a figure at his right hand facing towards his subjects, and this person has a kingdom that's given by God and rules over God's subjects, then this figure is being identified as equal with God in that fashion. That's the point that Yeshua also is bringing, without saying it so in your face that it can't be received because it's so shocking. How is it that David referred to his descendant as Lord? If David knew that it was just his son, the Hebrew word ben, why does David call him Lord? So captured in this word Lord must be the idea, at least in the first century, that this figure, Lord, is someone exalted at God's right hand, is someone who is recognized as co-equal with God on some level. And this is where the rub is for those who are non-Trinitarians, those who are human Jesus onlyers, right? I'm creating a phrase that I've never heard before. It's my own. Human Jesus onlyers, right? Human Jesus onlyism. All right, like KJV onlyism. All right, so people who believe that Jesus merely a human is only a human. How can you be equal with God in any fashion? Now, I know they're probably going to say, well, in the spirit, we have also been raised to God, and we're seated in heavenly places with God as well, but that doesn't make us divine. But the Bible is not only giving us the divinity of the Messiah using this passage. We're not cherry picking, people. I'm not saying that this is the only place in the Bible that outlines or defines Jesus' divinity. Far from it. There are other passages, I've already mentioned this before, but how can God create the world through Jesus if Jesus wasn't in existence until the first century? And last time I checked, the world was not created in the first century. Right? You got a problem there with your logic if you think that Jesus is merely a human, and yet God created the worlds through Jesus. Even if you don't think that Jesus is the creator, which, granted, that's an argument, right? I believe that Jesus is the creator, but there are people who believe that he isn't. Some people think he's just an agent, right? Like Joseph Good, like Anthony Buzzard. They believe that Jesus is merely an agent. Even the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus is the first creature created by God, who then created the rest of the cosmos. So at least even the Jehovah's Witnesses give Jesus more than human status, right? They take a step. They have a higher Christology than biblical Unitarian, is what I'm trying to say. But all of that is within the context of the New Testament portraying our Messiah as more than human in more than one place. So even if this psalm has to be thrown out because of its ambiguity, let's say we Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians go to court in God's courtroom, and we're arguing over the exact meaning of Adoni versus Adonai. And I think I'll draw my study to a close with this because I'm ranting and I'm standing on my soapbox, and I can say I'm not going to get to my study, so we'll leave off with this. Even if we brought this psalm into court as our evidence, and it so happens often in courtroom scenes, evidence is brought before the judge, right? You have the prosecuting attorney on one side and the defending attorney on the other side, and they bring this evidence before the judge, and because of its ambiguity or its equivocation, or because of its uncertainty, the judge says, you know what? We're going to throw that evidence out. We can't. It's not admissible in court. Sorry, neither one gets to use it. So the evidence is nullified. It's rendered null and void. We can't use it. We have to use something else to prove our argument. Even if we had to throw Psalm 110 out because we can't decide whether it's Adoni versus Adonai, who's sitting where, who's who, is he human, is he divine? And so in the end, if God the Father said, okay, fine, you both win and you both lose, throw out Psalm 110. Sorry, even the worms ate up Psalm 110 in the Dead Sea Scrolls cave. Sorry, it hasn't been preserved so that we can know exactly which Hebrew was original, right? By God's providence, the worms ate up Psalm 110. We don't have it, right? That's not a joke. That's reality, people. But even if we threw that out, and therefore we have to remove Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of Jesus quoting from Psalm 110. We throw that conversation out as well. It still doesn't change the fact that we have other passages. Not close with this. We have other passages in the Bible that Jesus utilizes, that the New Testament writers also utilize to demonstrate that Jesus is divine. Right? So we are not guilty of cherry picking and resting all of our argument on this single bit of evidence that is somewhat questionable, somewhat mysterious, somewhat ambiguous, or equivocal. We don't know what to make of Psalm 110. Did the Masoretes really alter it? Did they really change it from Yahweh to Adoni, or from Adoni to Adonai, or from Adonai to Adoni? That whole discussion that we've been having is, what really can we trust from the Masoretic text? Well, I'm going to close with this. I'll tell you what, we'll pick this up next week. What I want to do is I keep showing you guys this, but I never get to it. How did the scribes alter Psalm 110? Did they really alter it? Maybe they didn't, right? This is a hotly contested issue as well. Did the ancient scribes change things? Did it really say Yahweh in one spot and they changed it to Adonai, or change it from Adonai to Adoni, or change it from Adoni to Adonai? Right? What did the Hebrew really read originally? And then we've got something 1,000 years later that reads something slightly different. We don't know. Okay, those are some questions we'll begin to look at. There's a commentary from a Christian author, Pastor David Guzik, that I think is well trusted. We'll look at his commentary in time. We'll look at Messianic Jewish apologist Michael Brown, Dr. Michael Brown. He wrote a commentary set called Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, and we'll look at his notes from the objection of Psalm 110 does not say Messiah is Lord. We'll look at his answer to that. And then we also have Tim Haig's article about the Tetragrammaton name and the word Lord. If I can find some resources there, I'd share with you. I was reading through a little bit of that earlier, and I didn't find what I was looking for, but we might utilize that. And then we have kind of a layman's discussion on this, rather than using seminarians and pastors and those versed in Hebrew and Greek. Let's see what just ordinary people like you and I think about this. So this is kind of a blog discussion about this particular psalm, just from a non-scholarly perspective. And then the last two resources, I don't think I'm going to use this, Psalm 110 Reconsidered. I read through this week, and it doesn't, let me remove it from my bookmark there. It doesn't have anything really that I want to utilize, so I'm going to take that one out. But I do want to look at the human Messiah Jesus, thehumanjesus.org has a blog post or website where they've got an article entitled Adonai or Adoni, We Do Know. And I think this is a non-Trinitarian perspective, and we'll look at that in time as well. But that'll do it for Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism.